Armor shatters, infection leaks, and the arena turns funeral quiet. The game rewrites victory as mercy, recasting boss fights as acts of reluctant compassion. Hollow Knight was by no means the first game to construct a desolate world long beyond its prime, but it did something ingenious with the concept to match its more cartoonish art style. Where FromSoft used its post-apocalyptic worlds to instill dread and terror in the hearts of its players, Team Cherry instead used melancholy and sorrow, making Hallownest a tragic world rather than a terrifying one. Compare the two ruined city settings in Dark Souls and Hollow Knight. Undeadburg was certainly once a thriving community at some point in the past, but you don't feel that sense of loss when you're there, whilst the City of Tears stands as a metropolitan grave for a once flourishing capital, and you can physically see the immense loss of this place manifested in its sorrowful tears. This design philosophy can be seen in multiple locations throughout Hollow Knight, but where it's most effective is in the boss fights. Now, in difficult games like FromSoft and Hollow Knight, it's hard to make me feel bad for the bosses after they just spent the last hour kicking my teeth in. And while I hope Melania suffers in her final moments despite her wistful background, real men cried when they took down Sith, as she was a good girl who wanted to protect her master. However, Hollow Knight takes a much more direct and effective approach into making its formidable foes sympathetic. And this is apparent from one of the earliest bosses you'll encounter in the game, the False Knight. Now, False Knight is quite a clever fight, as it's hard on both your first attempt and a replay. During the first attempt, it's because he's the first real skill check of the game, and most players are going to die a couple of times while adjusting to the difficulty. But on a replay, he's easily the hardest fight you have to beat without the dash, which would have become a player's crutch during their previous playthrough, meaning that he constantly messes with the player's muscle memory as they struggle to readjust to their neutered state. But he's an equally clever boss fight from a conceptual level. As this hulking behemoth that ruthlessly slams his weapon into the ground, the player might assume he's a wrathful creature that seeks to stop the knight from journeying deeper into Hallownest. His imposing design is certainly reminiscent of the Asylum Demon, a rotund creature that serves as a warden to the early game's levels. So maybe the moniker of False Knight comes from his lack of discipline and restraint, and he was deemed unworthy by whatever round table governed Hallownest. And since at this point you think Hollow Knight is just another in a long line of indie Metroidvania Souls-likes, you don't think twice about kicking him to the curb. But then you crack his armor, and out tumbles a meek and defenseless maggot, who flops over in death. Now, this design naturally draws sympathy as it's cute, so maybe you feel a little bad for killing him, but there are still questions to be answered. And much later, after you defeat his dream variant, then the full extent of his story is revealed. He was a maggot that wanted to protect his siblings, and came across this massive suit of armor, which he then took with the intention of using it to keep his family safe from the many dangers surrounding them. At this point, I assumed that all that wild flailing and reckless abandon was because I was getting too close to his family, and all that fury was the righteous spirit of a big brother trying to defend their younger siblings, a feeling that I know all too well. But as I began to unravel the secrets of Hallownest, the far more horrifying truth was made apparent to me. The False Knight was already dead before I met him, mentally at least. He had been taken by the infection and driven into madness, never been able to see or recognize his family again. But that's when it hit me. The orange goo that had spurted from every foe I defeated was this malicious infection that had driven this society into madness. Many boss fights in Hollow Knight are puppets of the rot, their minds trapped within their bodies, which no longer follow their commands. It's the ultimate gut punch that nearly every single enemy up to this point has been a victim of this pandemic. This is the brilliance of Hollow Knight. It plays on your expectations by making you a small bug in a big scary world. You naturally assume that the world hates you because this is a Souls-like where the enemies are ferocious and the difficulty is high. But by reframing every single creature in the game as a victim of tragedy, it retroactively makes you pity each and every one of them, turning the expectations of an oppressive world that we naturally expected and transforming it into a suffering one, begging to be put out of its misery. Hollow Knight expertly weaves the personal tragedies of the boss into the greater world, and by making our protagonist have a blank expression, It adds so much depth as you imagine what expression the knight's face must be twisted into when he puts a lost soul to rest. I'll be back in 2 days. For another essay about a character who hides hidden pain beneath a mask, here's one about Master Chief.